Claire never imagined that love could turn into something so silent and suffocating. At first, everything seemed so tender, so caring. Ethan was attentive, the kind of man who held doors open and remembered her favorite coffee. He made her feel special, as if she were the only person in the world. When they started living together, Claire felt like she was living a fairy tale. He would prepare breakfast with a smile and serve it at the table, saying, "You trust me, don't you?" She'd smile back, because of course she trusted him. How could she not? Ethan always seemed to know what was best for her, or at least, that's what he made her believe. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible. "That bread isn't good for you, love. Why don't you try something healthier?" Claire laughed, amused by his concern. Swapping bread for fruit didn't seem like a big deal. The next day, he suggested she skip the sugar in her coffee. "You'll feel so much better without it," he said, holding her hand. And that's how it began. Small suggestions that, before Claire could even realize, turned into rules. Dinners became more controlled. What used to be spontaneous, like ordering pizza or raiding the fridge in the middle of the night, turned into quiet arguments. "You don't need that right now, do you?" Ethan would say with his sweet voice, but there was something in his eyes that made her step back. Claire started feeling guilty for wanting simple things, like a slice of cake or a piece of chocolate after dinner. She convinced herself that Ethan was only trying to help her. Over time, the kitchen stopped feeling like a safe place. The cupboards were gradually emptied, and the food she loved disappeared, replaced by healthy items, all approved by Ethan. The problem was that, despite all the changes, Claire started feeling weaker and weaker. One ordinary afternoon, while setting the table for dinner, Claire noticed something had changed. Her clothes were looser, her shoulders thinner. In the mirror, her face looked paler than she remembered. She brushed it off with a forced smile. "It's just work stress," she told herself, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Claire's mother, Linda, was the first to notice. During a visit, Linda watched her daughter closely, her eyes taking in every detail. "Are you eating properly, sweetheart?" Claire laughed nervously. "Of course, Mom. Ethan takes care of me." But something in Linda's expression said she wasn't convinced. That evening, sitting on the couch beside Ethan, Claire tried to bring up her mother's concern, but he quickly changed the subject. "Your mom worries too much. She doesn't understand our lifestyle." Claire nodded in agreement, but inside her, a small sense of unease was beginning to grow. It was during a silent, sleepless night when hunger struck harder than usual that Claire gave in. She got up quietly, walked to the kitchen, and opened the fridge. She grabbed a piece of bread she had hidden behind the vegetables and bit into it quickly, chewing slowly, feeling a mix of pleasure and guilt. But before she could swallow, a voice echoed from the doorway. "Claire." She froze. Ethan was standing there, watching her with a cold, disappointed expression. The silence was heavy, suffocating. He walked toward her, took the bread from her hand, and threw it in the trash without saying a word. Claire felt her face burn with shame. He left the kitchen without looking back, leaving her there, alone, feeling like a child who had done something terrible. That night, Claire realized this was no longer love. The days went by, and with them, hunger became a constant presence in Claire's life. It wasn't just the hunger for food, but a hunger for freedom, for the feeling that she still had control over her own life. Ethan always seemed to know when she was on the verge of breaking. He had a way of showing up in the kitchen at the exact moment Claire tried to grab something to eat. Their routine became rigid. Meals were measured with precision, and any attempt to question it was met with a disapproving look. "You don't need that right now, love. I know what's best for you," he'd repeat, always calm, always in control. And Claire, growing weaker by the day, would simply nod. But her body disagreed. The trembling in her hands started small, then became more frequent. Dizziness became a regular part of her day. Claire tried to hide it, leaning on furniture discreetly, smiling whenever Ethan asked if she was okay. "Just a little tired," she'd say, as though trying to convince herself it was true. One afternoon, while folding laundry, the world suddenly spun around her. She had to sit on the floor for a few minutes, taking deep breaths. When she looked up, her reflection stared back at her from the glass door of the washing machine. pale face, deep dark circles, slouched shoulders. She barely recognized herself anymore. That same night, Claire decided she had to do something. She waited until Ethan was sound asleep, then crept quietly to the kitchen. Opening a drawer, she pulled out a small pack of cookies she'd hidden days earlier. Sitting on the floor in the dark, she ate slowly, letting the sweet taste fill her mouth like an act of rebellion. But it didn't last long. The next day, Ethan was more vigilant. He began locking the cabinets. "I need to help you resist temptation," he said as he clicked a discreet padlock into place. Claire stood in silence, feeling a tightness in her chest. This wasn't about health anymore. It never had been. Rachel, her sister, called often. "Claire, you've been acting strange. What's going on?" Claire smiled through the phone, trying to sound normal. "I'm fine, just taking better care of myself." But Rachel didn't sound convinced. "Are you sure? You seem different." Claire simply repeated the same line she told everyone. "Ethan just wants what's best for me." But the truth was, Claire wasn't sure of anything anymore. One afternoon, while setting the table for dinner, Rachel showed up unexpectedly. Claire tried to mask her surprise and exhaustion. "Oh, hi. What a surprise." Rachel studied her closely, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you eating properly, Claire?" Claire turned her gaze to the plates. "Of course. Ethan takes care of everything." Rachel pressed on. "Can we go out and grab something to eat together?" Claire's heart raced. Ethan was in his office and would surely disapprove. She gave a nervous smile. "I can't. I have some things to do." Rachel sighed but didn't push further. After her sister left, Claire sat at the table, staring at the empty plate in front of her. Her stomach growled, and the hunger was almost unbearable. When Ethan walked into the kitchen, he looked at her and smiled. "I knew you could resist." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the tears sting behind her eyelids. She was resisting, yes, but resisting who? That night, lying beside Ethan, Claire realized it was becoming harder and harder to tell the difference between love and fear. Hunger was no longer something that came and went. It was always there. Claire woke up with her stomach in knots, but the sensation was worse than hunger itself. It was the emptiness, the weakness that consumed every part of her body. Even getting out of bed felt like an impossible task. Her muscles seemed to resist her, and the weight of her loose clothes only reminded her of how much she had changed. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. Sitting at the breakfast table, he would look at Claire with a soft smile, but his eyes analyzed every detail, every movement. When she brought her teacup to her mouth with trembling hands, he noticed. "You've been so distracted lately, love. You need to focus on taking better care of yourself." Claire didn't respond. She simply nodded and forced a smile. The truth was that taking care of herself felt impossible. Every meal had turned into a silent battlefield. Whenever she put food on her plate, she felt Ethan's eyes following her every move. Small portions, tiny bites. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was enough to assert control. One afternoon, while organizing her wardrobe, Claire tried on one of her favorite shirts, something she used to wear all the time. But now, the fabric hung off her body as though it belonged to someone else. She looked in the mirror, and a tightness grew in her chest. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Her shoulder bones protruding, her face lifeless, her lips pale. The ringing of the phone broke her thoughts. It was Rachel. "Claire, I'm worried. Can we meet?" Claire hesitated. Ethan hated unplanned visits, but something deep inside her craved a moment away from him. They met at a cafe near her home. When Rachel saw Claire walk through the door, she nearly dropped her cup. "Oh my God, Claire. You're so thin." Claire tried to laugh it off. "That's silly. I'm fine." Rachel took her hands, noticing how cold they were. "This isn't just exhaustion, Claire. You're sick." Claire wanted to deny it, to say everything was under control, but tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. "Ethan just wants to help me, Rachel. He thinks it's what's best for me." Her sister sighed, shaking her head. "This isn't help, Claire. This is control." When Claire returned home, she found Ethan in the living room, his expression unnervingly calm. "How was your coffee with your sister?" he asked. Her throat tightened. It was good. He stood slowly and walked toward her. Did she talk about me? Claire avoided his gaze. She just said she misses me. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then smiled and kissed her forehead. You know everything I do is because I love you, right? Claire nodded slowly, but deep down, something was beginning to shift. That night, lying next to him, her heart raced. What if Rachel was right? What if this wasn't love but a prison? The thought haunted her until dawn. Claire knew something was wrong, but admitting it out loud felt impossible. Every day was a cycle of weakness, silence, and fear. Ethan's gaze was always there, hovering over her like a shadow that never faded. He stayed close, ensuring every meal was controlled, every choice scrutinized. Claire began to realize she no longer had any will of her own. She only obeyed, merely survived. One morning, as she tried to brush her hair in the bathroom, her trembling hands let the brush slip from her grasp. She bent down to pick it up, but before she could, everything went black. Dizziness overtook her, and Claire collapsed onto the floor. The noise brought Ethan rushing in. He found her unconscious, her eyes fluttering open slowly, her breathing heavy. You need to take better care of yourself, he said, helping her up. Claire gripped the sink, her pale face staring back at her in the mirror. Ethan stood nearby, his calm demeanor feeling more like a threat than genuine concern. I do everything for you, Claire. Why do you insist on making things so difficult? She only shook her head, too afraid to respond. Later that day, Rachel showed up unexpectedly. Claire hesitated before opening the door, but her sister was persistent. When Rachel saw her, she froze for a moment. Claire looked even weaker, her thin arms, her lifeless eyes. Claire, what's going on here? Rachel asked, her voice filled with worry. Before Claire could answer, Ethan appeared in the living room, a tense smile on his face. Rachel, it's so nice to see you. Claire hasn't been feeling well lately. Rachel's eyes darted between Claire and Ethan, suspicion written all over her face. This doesn't look like just that, she said firmly. Claire tried to step in. I'm fine, Rachel. But her voice was too soft, too faint. Rachel wasn't convinced for a second. Let's go out for a bit, Rachel said, taking her sister's hand. Claire froze, feeling Ethan's gaze burning into her back. He smiled, but his eyes were ice cold. I don't think Claire needs to go anywhere right now, he said, his tone deceptively gentle. Rachel wasn't intimidated. She can speak for herself. Claire looked at Ethan, then at Rachel. For a moment, fear held her in place, but then something inside her snapped. She gripped her sister's hand and said, I'll go out for a bit. Ethan didn't stop her. He simply stood there, watching as Claire walked out the door. But Claire knew this wouldn't be the end. In the car, Rachel drove in silence, giving her sister space. After a few minutes, Claire whispered, I don't know who I am anymore. Rachel squeezed her hand. We'll figure it out together. Claire remained silent the entire drive to Rachel's apartment. The world outside the car felt different, wider, more intimidating. Every turn Rachel made seemed like a reminder that Ethan could be lurking somewhere, watching, waiting. Rachel glanced at her sister from time to time, as though ready to say something, but she knew Claire needed the silence to process everything that had happened. When they arrived at the apartment, Claire hesitated before stepping out of the car. Her fingers trembled against the door handle, as though opening it would mean crossing a point of no return. Rachel noticed and placed a gentle hand over hers. You're safe here, she said, her voice firm yet kind. Claire took a deep breath and finally stepped out. As soon as she entered her sister's small apartment, the familiar smell of fresh coffee mixed with lavender greeted her. It was a warm, comforting scent, so unlike the cold, calculated atmosphere of the home she had shared with Ethan. Claire sank into the couch, hugging her knees as Rachel stood nearby, watching, waiting for her to speak. He's going to find me, Claire whispered after a while. Rachel crossed her arms and leaned against the kitchen table. Maybe, but you don't have to go back. Claire shook her head slowly, as if trying to convince herself. He won't accept it. At that moment, Claire's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach churned. Ethan's name glowed on the display, a stark reminder that he still held power over her. Rachel walked over, took the phone from her hand, and said firmly, "You don't have to talk to him right now." Claire didn't respond, staring at her empty hands instead. In the days that followed, Claire tried to adjust. Rachel encouraged her to eat small portions, sip coffee on the balcony, and take small steps toward reclaiming her life. But every bite felt like a battle, and every reassuring look from Rachel felt like a reminder of how far she was from who she used to be. On the third night, Claire woke up gasping for air. She had dreamt she was back in Ethan's house, locked in, powerless to scream. She sat up in bed, hugging her knees and trying to steady her breathing. Rachel appeared at the door, her eyes sleepy but filled with concern. "Do you want to talk?" Rachel asked softly. Claire shook her head, but Rachel sat down beside her anyway. "I don't know how I got here," Claire murmured after a long silence. Rachel sighed, gently running her fingers through her sister's hair. "It happened slowly. So slowly, you don't even notice." The next morning, Claire decided to go for a walk. She pulled on a loose shirt and dark sunglasses, as if trying to hide from the world. But as soon as she turned the corner, her heart started racing. She felt like Ethan could appear at any moment, materializing out of the crowd. When someone brushed past her too quickly, she flinched. "He's here," she whispered, gripping Rachel's arm tightly. "Claire, breathe." "He's not here," Rachel said gently, but the fear refused to leave. When they returned home, Claire saw her phone vibrate again. Ethan's name lit up the screen once more. This time, Rachel didn't hesitate. She picked up the call. "She doesn't want to talk to you," Rachel said firmly. There was a pause, and then Rachel's expression hardened. "No, Ethan, you can't come here." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Does he want to come here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel ended the call and turned to her sister. "Don't worry. He's not going to find you." But Claire wasn't so sure. The fear still lingered, an unshakable presence in her mind. That morning, Rachel left early for work, leaving Claire alone in the apartment. For the first time in a long while, Claire had a moment entirely to herself. The silence here was different, not oppressive like the silence in her home with Ethan. But even so, fear lingered. The feeling that he could show up at any moment wouldn't leave her mind. She walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stood still for a moment, staring at the fully stocked shelves. She could eat whatever she wanted. There was no one there to say no, but the freedom felt strange, almost forbidden. She picked up a slice of bread, holding it in her trembling hands. Guilt washed over her like a tidal wave, bringing with it Ethan's voice echoing in her mind. "You don't need that, Claire." It wasn't until she heard a knock at the door that she dropped the bread onto the counter, her heart racing. Her feet felt glued to the floor as the knocking grew louder. Claire moved slowly toward the door, peeking through the peephole, and felt her blood turn cold. Ethan was standing there. She backed away, her breathing shallow. He didn't know where Rachel lived, or did he? Her phone began vibrating on the table. It was him. Claire covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle her tears. The knocking continued, insistent. "Claire, I know you're in there. We need to talk." His voice sounded calm, as always. But Claire knew what hid behind that calm. She froze in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. Her body screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to move. "You can't ignore me forever, love," he continued, his tone lower now. "I just want to talk to you." Claire's eyes darted between the phone and the door. The feeling of being cornered made her chest tighten as she began to hyperventilate. The room started spinning. Then the phone rang again. This time, it was Rachel. With trembling hands, Claire answered. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay where you are," Rachel said firmly. "Don't open the door. I'm on my way." Outside, Ethan was still calling her name, his voice more persistent now. Claire backed away to the couch, curling up as though she could make herself invisible. Each knock on the door sent another jolt of fear through her chest. Minutes later, though it felt like an eternity, Rachel arrived. As soon as she saw Claire sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and her face pale, Rachel's worry turned to anger. She marched to the door and threw it open. "You're not welcome here, Ethan." Ethan gave a slight smile, as if nothing about the situation was out of the ordinary. "I just want to talk to her." Rachel crossed her arms, standing firmly in the doorway. "She doesn't want to talk to you. Leave." For a moment, Claire thought he might insist, but then he took a step back, exhaled deeply, and said, "She always comes back to me, Rachel. Always." And with that, he walked away. Rachel shut the door and knelt beside her sister, taking her cold hands in her own. "You're safe here, Claire." But deep down, Claire didn't feel safe. She knew Ethan wouldn't give up so easily. After Ethan's unexpected visit, Claire realized that physically escaping wasn't enough. He was still inside her, in the way she stared at plates of food, as if each meal were a trap, in how she flinched whenever the phone rang, in the guilt that crept in every time she thought about taking a step forward. Even from a distance, Ethan still held power over her. Rachel tried to help. She prepared colorful, nutritious meals, played soft music in the kitchen, and tried to distract her sister with conversations about simple things, a new recipe, a TV show. But Claire would only offer faint smiles, never truly present. One morning, Rachel suggested a walk in the park. Claire hesitated, but eventually agreed. As they stepped outside, the fresh breeze brushed against her face, and for the first time in weeks, Claire felt a sliver of relief. Walking among other people, seeing children playing, hearing laughter, it all seemed so far removed from the reality she'd been living for months. Yet, at the same time, every unfamiliar face made her heart race. They sat on a bench, and Rachel broke the silence. "You need to start forgiving yourself, Claire." Claire looked at her sister, startled. "I don't know how," she admitted, her voice trembling. Rachel offered a soft smile. "You don't have to know right now. You just have to try." Back at the apartment, Claire stared at the plate Rachel set in front of her. On it was a slice of cake, something Ethan would never have allowed. For a long moment, she looked at it as though it were forbidden. But then she took a deep breath, picked up the fork, and cut a small piece. She brought it to her lips, letting the sweet, comforting flavor fill her mouth. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel guilty. In the days that followed, Claire began to challenge herself. Small actions that might seem insignificant to others but felt monumental to her. Preparing a meal on her own, choosing her clothes without hearing Ethan's voice echo in her mind, walking to the grocery store without feeling like someone was watching her. Each small victory was a step further away from the life she'd endured. But Ethan didn't give up. The calls continued, and Claire knew he was waiting for her to slip. She would pick up the phone, see his name on the screen, feel her fingers tremble, but she wouldn't answer. Rachel, always by her side, would hold her hand and remind her, "You're in control now." One day, Claire found the courage to block his number. Her heart raced as she pressed the button, but at the same time, a wave of relief washed over her. It was as if, at last, she was starting to sever the invisible ties that had bound her to him. It was on a sunny afternoon that Claire had an important realization. Sitting on the apartment balcony, sipping tea without a rush, she noticed that, for the first time in a long time, she was breathing without fear. Rachel appeared in the doorway and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Claire looked out at the horizon, her lips curling into a timid smile. "About everything I still have to live for." In that moment, she knew that starting over was possible. Do you think it's easy to recognize when you're trapped in an abusive relationship? What would you do in Claire's place? Let me know in the comments.